You've heard it. Russian President Putin has drafted over 200,000 of his own citizens to the military, and the number is growing. Today I'm talking about military draft happening in Russia. We'll also look how the U.S. and NATO might get sucked into the war and how it'll impact the U.S. and world economy. If you think we're sitting all safe and pretty, don't get too comfortable, because things are just heating up and you'll be surely impacted, either directly if we join the war or indirectly when inflation and low supplies get worse. Mobilization is when a country organizes and assembles its military resources for a particular objective, like a special military operation or war. There are various nuances of it, and you can call it conscription or military draft. But pretty much, we're talking about gathering people and supplies. Here in the U.S., conscription is a decision that's made by Congress and the President. When you get drafted, you are legally required to serve in the military. Historically speaking, here in the United States, Americans were conscripted during the American Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and also the Vietnam War. As little as 10% of drafted soldiers made up the force in the Civil War. Around 50% of American soldiers who fought in the First and Second World War were drafted. Compare that to 1/3 of Americans who were drafted into the Korean War and 1/5 who were drafted into the Vietnam War. There was also something in the U.S. that was known as Selective Training and Service Act. During 1940 all the way to 1973, under this act, men were drafted to fill spots in the U.S. Armed Forces that were empty due to insufficient number of volunteers. This act applied in terms of peace or conflict. But once 1973 came about, under President Nixon, the U.S. government decided to end active conscription. Instead, signing up for the military became completely voluntary. So, does that mean that military conscription is over for good? Well, no. Conscription is still technically in place on a contingency basis. Every single documented or undocumented male in the U.S. right now, including immigrants who are 18 through 25, are required to register with the Selective Service System known as the SSS. The SSS is an independent agency of the U.S. government that keeps information about every U.S. citizen or resident who can potentially be conscripted. And under Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution and 10 U.S. Code number 246, U.S. federal law provides for the compulsory conscription for militia service for men between 17 and 45 years old, and even certain women. But let's jump back to the current condition in the Ukraine. Now, we all know about U.S. sanctions on Russian banks, investments, businesses, oil, and more ever since Russia invaded Ukraine back in February 2022. To put it in perspective, last year, that is, before the war, the U.S. imported some $18 billion worth of mineral fuels, oil, and distillation products from Russia. But then came Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and sanctions changed everything. Yet, despite current sanctions, the U.S. still depends on Russia for other things. For example, the most common products imported from Russia before the Ukrainian invasion included mineral fuels. I'm talking about $13 billion worth, and $2.2 billion worth of precious metals and stones, including platinum, $1.4 billion worth of iron and steel, $963 million worth of fertilizers, and $763 million worth of inorganic chemicals. But here's where things could get worse, and it has to do with NATO. Now I'm talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In 1949, NATO was founded by 12 countries: Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the U.S. Today, NATO has 30 members. Right now, NATO has been avoiding joining the Ukraine war. This past September, Russia installed officials in Ukraine to stage referendums. Basically, they asked the people in 4 Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine to vote on whether they want to remain with Ukraine or join Russia. Russia claims that the people in these parts want to join Russia. The Western nations are denouncing this as a sham referendum, and the UN says that the referendums were organized in violation to the UN Charter and therefore it's illegal under international law. There's speculation that Ukraine might possibly hold its own referendum to see if certain parts want to join Poland or Romania. Let me explain. Poland joined NATO in 1999, and Romania joined NATO in 2004. So if parts of Ukraine were to vote in favor of joining Poland or Romania, they would effectively be adopted by these countries. And if Poland or Romania were to adopt these parts of the Ukraine, these two countries would in effect be obligated to protect it under the newly adopted land and people. And remember, these two countries are members of NATO. And wouldn't now this mean that NATO would need to get more actively involved in the Ukraine war? So just imagine you are Ukraine for a second. You're facing the threat of losing your entire country to Russia. And your only option, other than fighting, is to become allies with another country. But right now, countries like the the UK, Germany, France want nothing to do with directly joining the war. Their way of helping Ukraine is to supply arms. So now, if you're Ukraine, you're left with two options: surrender to the Russians or join another country. When you look at history, this isn't a stretch. Actually, not many people know this, but Ukraine used to be part of Poland way longer than it used to be part of Russia. So imagining parts of Ukraine or joining Poland isn't that far of a stretch or a cultural shock. Now, NATO still has no plans or desire to join the war directly. But if this referendum or scenario ends up actually happening and parts of Ukraine were to join the NATO countries, like Poland or Romania, this may critically push NATO to join the war. What next? Well, to answer that, we have to go all the way back to the reason why Putin invaded Ukraine in the first place. In a 5,000-word essay on the Kremlin's website, Putin claimed that Russia and Ukraine were one people. And he further claimed that Ukraine didn't exist as a separate state and that it was never a nation to begin with. Once Putin put his words into action and invaded Ukraine, this left many people wondering if Putin will also try to reassemble all the countries that used to be part of the old Soviet Union. But here's the thing: some former Soviet countries like Latvia and Lithuania are now a part of NATO. So if the war comes to a NATO country like Poland, what would stop Putin from attacking other ex-Soviet countries that are now part of NATO? Ukrainian President Zelensky has already repeatedly called on NATO to enforce a no-fly zone over the Ukraine. But NATO leaders have so far decided that a direct confrontation with Russia like this would be too high of a risk to take presently. Then there's Article 5 in the North Atlantic Treaty. Any NATO member can invoke Article 5 to call for support from fellow NATO members. So far in history, this article has only been used once. It was actually used by the U.S. after the infamous 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York and Washington, D.C. But here's the thing: Article 5 is not an automatic guarantee that every NATO country will send soldiers to assist in the event of attack. What Article 5 does say is that military action is an option for the alliance's collective defense. But if this article is invoked by a NATO country like Poland, public statements from Westminster have left many expecting the UK to honor their obligation to join the fight. If NATO does end up joining the war, what does it mean for the U.S.? Well, the U.S. is a NATO country, so it would automatically become involved. So will there be a draft here in the United States? We don't know for sure, but what we do know is that NATO is committed to a peaceful resolution of disputes. But if diplomatic efforts don't work, they have the military power to undertake what they call crisis management operations. An attack against one NATO ally is an attack against all of them. So we can't deny the possibility of the U.S. enforcing a draft if NATO gets invoked. Just look back at the Vietnam War, for example. It started in 1954, and the war involved the Communist government of North Vietnam versus South Vietnam as its principal ally, the United States. In the 1950s, there were less than 800 U.S. troops deployed in South Vietnam, but by 1962, there were over 9,000 troops. Despite lots of anti-war sentiment in the U.S., in July 1965, President Lyndon Baines Johnson authorized an immediate dispatch of 100,000 troops, and then he authorized another dispatch of 100,000 troops in 1966. In 1967, some 35,000 protested against the Vietnam War. Between July 1966 and December 1973, more than 503,000 U.S. military personnel deserted the Army. Ultimately, over 58,000 Americans were killed in the Vietnam War. After American troops returned home from 1973, America learned that we had spent more than $120 billion to help with the conflict in Vietnam. This led to mass inflation that only got worse during the worldwide oil crisis in 1973, with skyrocketing fuel prices. Russian mobilization has already had a major impact on the car industry because of the sanctions on Russian crude oil. There were shortages across the globe. Gas prices spiked, and so did car prices. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, multiple car companies like Ferrari, Stellantis, and Ford refused to conduct further business with Russia. Other companies pulled out due to parts shortages and low stock of tech equipment needed for the vehicles. Several weeks ago, another car brand was potentially added to that list: Mazda. In 2021, Mazda sold 30,000 cars, but the Japanese brand apparently wanted to end vehicle production at its joint venture plant in Vladivostok. The previous March 2022, Mazda announced they'd be ending exports of parts to the Russian plant, and that would end production after stocks ran out. And then Toyota announced they'd end their car production in Russia because of the interruption of key materials and parts supplies. But look, it's not just car companies that are pulling out of Russia. The war is impacting global output. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development announced that by the end of 2023, Russia's war in Ukraine will cost the global economy $2.8 trillion in economic output. Just look at Twitter and Elon Musk. Rumors say that Elon Musk initially backed out of the Twitter deal because of the possibility of Russian mobilization and nuclear threats. So you can see that conflicts and wars really push corporations to react and change their strategy. Let's face it, war is risky in business. Look at the dollar impact. Just look at Google. Back in May 2022, Google's Moscow-based subsidiary announced plans for bankruptcy. The reason? Russia's seizure of its assets made it impossible for Google to operate in that country. On top of that, Google confirmed that they moved most of their employees out of the country. But war doesn't always lead to bankruptcy. It can also take the other route. During the Vietnam War, many American companies actually profited from the Vietnam War immensely, even some that were initially heading toward bankruptcy. Logically, the companies that do well during wartime are those that develop weapons, aircraft, and chemicals. But you know, the worst energy crisis in decades is currently happening across the globe. Expanding natural gas infrastructure is not cheap, and you need to invest in it for years before seeing any major results you can actually use. Analysts have predicted that until the next summer of 2023, at the earliest, suppliers are unlikely to have the capacity to increase gas flow to Europe to an equal or high volume to replace Russian gas that was lost. The worst case scenario for companies would be the mass shutdown of any manufacturing industries that rely the most on natural gas. In the UK, Czech Republic, and Germany, people have already begun protesting exorbitant electricity bills. If things don't get better soon, expectations are that public protest will only get worse. But now you tell me, do you think NATO or the US will be pulled into the war? Please share by commenting below. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for your support.